Welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast with me, Jonathon Shafi. I'm the Campaigns Officer here at Common Weal, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Craig DL, who's the Head of Policy and Research at the think tank. Craig, welcome again to the show. We're getting towards the end of what has been a very difficult, challenging, and in some ways a year that I'm sure many people will want to forget, but very busy for us at the same time. At this time of the year, I always seem to get to the point where I've got more, not less, work to do, because you've got stuff to finish, stuff to round off before you move into the next year and go for some time off during Christmas. But how are you getting on yourself, and any reflections?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of much the same for me as well. That we're in that final crunch period. We're just coming to the end of our penultimate week before we break up for Christmas. Next week is our last week, so it's that panic period of tying up all the loose ends. It has not been the happiest of years, and it's certainly been a year that will be remembered for years to come. But, you know, we are starting to see light at the end of the tunnel. The vaccines are now starting to roll out. We're now starting to see the strategy for getting that vaccine to everyone. I was just discussing this with some of my family this morning. My mum in particular looks as if she'll be quite high up the priority list because she's a carer. So, you know, the vaccine's as much about protecting her as it is about protecting her clients. So I'm really glad to see that she's likely to get it quite early. I, on the other hand, being young, relatively fit, no health conditions, I'm right at the bottom of the list, which again is good because it means that everybody who needs it more than me will get it before me. How long that'll take to get down to the bottom list, we don't quite know yet. It will depend on the availability of vaccines, supply chains, how many more come online. We'll just have to wait and see. So it's light at the end of the tunnel, but probably still for many of us, you know, still going to be weeks, months of being as careful as we have been before we can start to think about what comes after.
Yeah, I mean, when me and you were talking about the whole situation, I suppose, and particularly at the start of the first lockdown back in March of this year, I do have to say that while we've still got a long way to go, I was not at all convinced that we'd be sitting here in December talking about the rollout of a vaccine. So we hope that next year will bring some of the optimism which you outlined there. And with that, let's move on to our topic for today. We wanted to look at an area of potential in Scotland, an area which we all know has got huge opportunities and huge, as I say, potential, but which isn't necessarily being met at the present moment. Because we think that's where often Common Weal can come in. We can say, here's an issue where we could be doing great things, but we're currently not, and we could be doing better, and that kind of thing. And that, in particular, for this episode, is going to be focused around some of our green energy potential. Now, Craig, who knows a lot more about this than I do, is going to be doing most of the talking here, and I've got a number of questions lined up, but we hope this is a useful discussion for listeners, and something that we want to be taking forward, not just next year, but into the future of an independent Scotland. So, Craig, I'm just going to start with a sort of opening question. Could you just, I suppose, give us a bit of an outline of where your thinking is around green energy in Scotland, and in particular, you want to talk about the potential of hydrogen within that context. But if you just start by giving us, I guess, the big picture on this question.
Yeah, so the question about energy in the Green New Deal was a major chapter in our Common Home plan. I remember after we published that book, about this time last year, the Common Weal team asked me to give a briefing on the book to sort of get everyone up to speed. And don't know if you remember, Jonathan, we ended up spending 6 hours in the office with me at that whiteboard talking through every single chapter in that book. So there was a lot in it, and energy is a big part of that. And even within that, hydrogen is a big potential area for Scotland to develop. But there are ways that we can do it right, and there's ways that we can do it wrong. And as we're starting to see the industry emerge, we're starting to see some of the warning signs come out, some of the stuff that we said that in our Common Home Plan, that this is the path that we should avoid. So I think we'll start by explaining there are different ways of generating hydrogen. And this kind of leads us into the foundations of what a hydrogen economy would look like, regardless of what it's used for, because there's different ways that we can use the energy source. The two main ones that are being advertised at the moment is so-called green hydrogen, which is generated from renewable sources. So you might have even done this experiment in high school chemistry class or physics class or something like that, where you take a couple of electrodes and you put them in some water and you pass a current through it and you split the water up. Water's made of hydrogen and oxygen. You split that up into its hydrogen and its oxygen. You can then gather the hydrogen, pressurize it, bottle it, store it, and then use it elsewhere. And this is if you're using a renewable energy source to create the electricity, this is a zero carbon method of generating hydrogen. Another way you can do it is what's known as blue hydrogen. And this is where you take methane or another hydrocarbon, another fossil fuel, and you combine it with water, steam, and again, you can use heat and pressure to process it, break down those molecules and extract the hydrogen, but what you're left with is CO2. So that CO2 can either be released into the atmosphere in exactly the same way as what would happen if we've just burned the natural gas or the fossil fuel, or there are plans to try and capture it and store it, but for reasons that it would be worth an entire podcast itself. The technology between carbon capture and storage is itself very difficult, very energy intensive, not proven at scale. But why would we do blue hydrogen? Well, the people pushing it is mostly the fossil fuel companies. They want to keep their business of extracting oil and extracting gas and maybe giving it a new badge in the greener world. So what I'd really encourage folk to do is lobby, the Scottish government and others, and whoever's involved in this. If we're going to generate a hydrogen economy, it needs to be the green hydrogen. We cannot go down that blue hydrogen route, because we're going to end up pretty much with the same kind of fight on our hands as we did when we tried to ban fracking.
Well, if you could just, first of all, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think the general picture is one where we have got this huge resource, and not only is it a big resource that could bring higher standards of living, but I presume cheaper energy costs as well as being environmentally friendly. One of the questions people might have, and I know you've touched on this, but how much power can this provide to the Scottish population, or is it something that we can also export? And secondly, how much is the cost of this? I'm not asking for pounds and pence, but is this a very expensive investment that needs to be made in order to manufacture this energy, to produce this energy? Or is it something that is affordable in the long run because of the rewards that it brings?
So there is quite a lot in there, and it does come down to the strategy about how you're using that hydrogen. And there is potential for it to be an exportable resource. We actually did a podcast on this quite a while ago. I'll have to actually go back and look at the number of the episode where we had a guest speaker on talking about the potential for hydrogen as an export or a trade good. If you are just creating the hydrogen and then using it immediately, if you're doing it via the green hydrogen route, then because there are always losses whenever you do any kind of work, any kind of transition, then you will lose energy from going from the creating the hydrogen to the transport of it to the use of it. And if you're using renewable electricity to do all this, then what that means is that you're going to require more electricity to create the hydrogen than you would get from just using the electricity. So it's going to be more expensive than renewable electricity if you're just doing it via that in and out process. However, as we know with a lot of renewable energies, they're not generally power sources that are on demand. You can only generate wind power when it's windy. You can only generate solar power when it's daytime. So if you're wanting to use electricity at night, you might need, or when the wind's not blowing, or when demand is otherwise overtaking supply, you might need some way of storing that electricity and then using it when you need it. And this is where hydrogen could be used in the Scottish energy economy. It could be used as a store. So you generate it cheaply when it is very windy or there's otherwise a lot of excess power going around. You generate the hydrogen, you store it, and then you use it at peak demand times when your supply is being outstripped by your demand. So it's got a use there in a broader strategic point of view. It's also going to be very useful in transport, because we also need to not just our electricity grids and our heating infrastructure, which we can talk about a bit later, but also in our transport sector. And this is something that we talk about in the Common Home Plan quite a lot. Technology might change, but right now, if you want to have a vehicle that doesn't have a petrol or a diesel engine, if it's a small vehicle like a car, then you're probably going to find that a battery and an electric vehicle is the most efficient way to do it. But if you're talking about a big vehicle, like a bus or a truck or a ferry or a cargo ship, then hydrogen might be the more efficient solution there. So Scotland, being a maritime nation with a lot of cargo needs, might have a really powerful incentive to develop a hydrogen economy for shipping, for cargo. It might also have an incentive to develop a very strong public transport network built around the hydrogen economy. And this is something actually that I was really excited to see. It's starting to happen to some degree in Scotland. There was an announcement of a plan for a company to start producing green hydrogen for buses in Glasgow. They want to be able to do this in time for the COP26 conference that has been delayed next year. Even more exciting, the company is going to be based just in the village just down the road from where I am. So when it becomes safe to do so, I might actually see if I can contact them and pay them a wee visit and see what they're doing. It sounds quite an interesting project.
Well, that's a pretty neat kind of segue into my next question, which is really, where are we with this? I mean, so much of the time I hear about these ideas and these possibilities from people like yourself, Craig, and others, and then I compare the ambition and the possibility outlined by people like you to what's actually happening and what's been led by the Scottish government. There just seems to be a disconnect there. There seems to be a real mismatch, because we've talked on this podcast about how lots of our green and natural assets are actually being sold off to the highest bidder, to global investors, rather than being kind of captured in the way that you talk about in order to sell to serve the people of Scotland and the environment of Scotland. So can you tell us a bit about where are we with this? I mean, you've talked about that company that's starting to produce green hydrogen, but generally speaking, where are we? What do you think needs to be done? What do we need to do more of to make this kind of thing a reality?
I mean, that example I gave there is one of the sort of good stories on this. It's a Scottish company that is doing this, and it's doing it for the local Scottish economy. And we want to see more of that. But yes, in the Scottish Government's programme for government, its strategy around this, it is very much focused on inward investment, i.e., money coming from out with Scotland, from foreign-owned companies, overseas-owned companies. And the problem with that is inevitably, those companies will want to see a return on their investment. So that means profits flowing from Scotland back out to where those companies are based. So we don't get to capture that wealth. We don't get to recirculate it in our economy. And that might be a convenient, politically expedient way of getting fast investment. But, we're wanting to move away from that, aren't we? We now have a Scottish National Investment Bank that has a a mission to provide long-term patient finance, we shouldn't be chasing that fast pump and dump model. We should be trying to look at a more foundational economics. We've got a paper on this specifically, but it also comes out in our Resilient Scotland plan of trying to build what's known as community wealth building and trying to build that foundation. So we're not just buying in services from the rest of the world and letting them capture both the profits, but also the technological benefits and the skills that come out of it. But we can start to grow that ourselves and, you know, potentially help others and you know, help other countries that are maybe coming up behind us to train them and get their workforces up to that standard so that they can do the same. Because, you know, every country has to have a Green New Deal now, and we're all working on the same timescales. We all have to work to the, you know, distinct versions of the same plan at the same time and finish at the same time, or it's all for nothing.
Yeah, and that kind of tells you where some of the issues are. I mean, one other question I wanted to kind of put to you was about the question of independence, because I know that in 2014, lots of the arguments that we were making in favour of independence were focused on our renewable energy sector and the potential for our renewable energy domestically and in terms of exports, in terms of becoming world leading in this field. Can you just for those who are listening, maybe just not so much underline those arguments, but are there issues that are raised around independence debate which are hardwired into this question? In other words, could we do better with the full powers of independence when it comes to these issues? How would that accentuate our abilities, do you think, in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, specifically with the hydrogen strategy, then that focus on exports can take on a different shape. When you're talking about exporting renewable electricity, you can only export that electricity to where you can lay cable. And right now, most of, you know, actually all of Scotland's electricity exports go through England. Whereas, and there are plans to develop a super grid between Scotland, Norway, and Iceland that would then potentially let Scotland access the European markets directly. That plan's currently, you know, stalled because of Brexit. But you might come back online. Whereas if you've got a hydrogen exporting economy, then you can export that hydrogen to wherever, because you can ship it, you can send it via ship. Yes, there are some difficulties that come out because of the lack of powers, the lack of independence, but not as many as you might think. Really, the big one is getting that patient finance. While I mentioned Scottish National Investment Bank, one of the big problems with the bank as it currently is it's got very limited access to funds. It can only really spend the money that the Scottish Government gives it directly. Whereas if we could get the dispensation from the UK Treasury to allow it to operate as a fully fledged investment bank, or if we had the powers of independence and could give it that power itself, then it would have access to almost unlimited funding and could fund the infrastructure changes that we need, and could do it in a way that doesn't need that pump and dump fast profit model that I spoke about earlier.
So this is something that we could be moving on right now, but which would be accentuated by independence. Yeah. Okay, so just I suppose coming towards the end here, what's in terms of the priorities moving forward? What would you really like to see happen in concrete terms over the next year to make this to bring this more into being? I mean, if you're a Scottish Government minister responsible for this area, or if you're looking at the landscape as it is as we move into the next election, and you're looking at the SNP returning a majority government, there surely is then the scope, if the political will is there, to roll this out in quite a big way. So I suppose, where do you see the pitfalls in that? I mean, is this a question of political will? And if so, what do you think has to be done to overcome that inertia?
Partly political will, but also mainly political strategy. It's where do you want to end up by the end of all of these policies coming into being? So the first priority, as I said, should be that investment. You know, we really need to get that capital in place, or we can't really do anything. The second part is getting the energy strategy right. As I say, we really cannot go down this route of blue hydrogen, not even as a stepping stone to a greener future, as the oil companies would sell it to us, because while they're saying that, they're also saying to their shareholders, they're saying that publicly, they've been saying it this week, that while they might reduce the amount of oil they produce, they're not in the business of getting out of the petrochem business anytime soon. So, they're not going to use it as a transition. They're going to use it as a means of making it look like they're transitioning. So we cannot go down that blue infrastructure route. Doing so is a distraction, not a stepping stone. Then it's, what do we want to use the hydrogen economy for? As I say, there's great potential for this in something like transport. There is good potential in balancing the renewable electricity grid, although this is also going to be in conjunction with other energy storage methods like pumped hydro or batteries or flywheels or whatever other storage technology works at a particular time at a particular scale. But the other big sector is heating. And this is something that, again, hydrogen is being put out as a solution to. So instead of having natural gas piped into your house, you could have hydrogen piped into your house instead. And there's actually a pilot scheme for this just starting in, just about to start in Fife, where they're going to try this out on a few homes and see what the consumer reaction is, because there's differences between hydrogen and natural gas. So if you're using it for cooking, for instance, I don't want to go too far into the chemistry, but basically the hydrogen flame is much harder to feed than a gas flame. So there's potentially differences in the way you have to use it and be careful around it. But there's also possibly differences in how you have to use your boiler. So it's going to be getting consumers used to the idea of hydrogen rather than natural gas. More critically, if we want to build this heating grid, then we need to replace our natural gas boilers with hydrogen boilers. We also need to do a lot of work on the piping infrastructure. A lot of our natural gas pipe network can't really take hydrogen. Hydrogen tends to leak through the seals and the joints, and there's differences in the way you have to pressurize it and pump it. So it could involve a lot of infrastructure upgrades to the gas grid if we want to go down this hydrogen route. Which then brings up the conversation that we talked about in the Common Home Plan, that if we're going to have to do this massive infrastructure change anyway, then is there a better way of doing it? And we've been arguing heavily that there is, and it's called a district heating system. So instead of pumping natural gas or hydrogen to a home and then using a home boiler to heat the house, you can use a large, much more efficient heating system to generate the heat and then pump the heat itself to the house via steam pipe. Very, very common virtually everywhere in the world, apart from Scotland, apart from the UK. We don't seem to do it. It's very common in a lot of countries in Europe and quite a lot of cities in America as well. Doing this, you have a much more efficient boiler system. For a start, large boilers are more efficient than small boilers. But even beyond that, it allows you to access other forms of heat that don't involve boilers. So instead of burning natural gas or hydrogen or biomass or whatever you want to burn for this heating system, you could also look at renewable energy sources like solar thermal or geothermal or other forms of heating that might come online in the future. The great advantage of going down a district heating system is that once you've installed the pipe and you've installed the heat exchangers in the houses, then if a new heating system comes online, you can plug it directly into the heating system and you don't need to go and bother all of these house owners again and replace their heating systems. Whereas if you lock someone into the hydrogen economy, then they will be forced to pay hydrogen prices. And as I said, there's good reason to believe that the hydrogen will remain more expensive than gas or electricity is at the moment. But you also lock them into that despite any technological changes that come along in the future. So having an energy strategy that is forward-looking and future-proof is a critical aspect of a Green New Deal. And that's something that I would really, really definitely push on the Scottish Government. Work out what you want this hydrogen economy to do. I will link to the Common Home Plan in the description. I really encourage people to read it in detail. because we lay out all the steps of what we think it should do to make the best use of the technology that's coming online, but also create the best social outcome once we do it.
Thanks, Craig. That's excellent, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the links as well. You know, this and on so many issues, we've just done a whole raft of work, and we're making an impact. We want to make an even bigger impact next year. We are going to be launching probably our most substantial campaign and movement building project next year. Towards the start of next year as well. So we're really looking forward to that. It will contain all kinds of policies that you can find in the Resilient Scotland papers, but also much of the Common Home plan as well, which Craig has referred to and will link to under this podcast. Now, next week, we want to finish the year with your questions. Craig, I'm going to sort of pass over to you here. What's your vision for the next episode? Because we've tried this once before and we felt it went quite well, where people send their questions in, but this was quite a good way to end the year. So if you just sort of talk to the listeners about the rationale behind it and how they can get involved.
Yeah, so yeah, as you say, we tried this a wee while ago. We asked folk for questions and ran through them, and it was great fun. I'd love to hear what people think about what we're thinking about, if that makes sense. Because it's one thing to just be speaking out into the void, and it's quite another to get a bit of views coming in. So what have we done well? What have we not done well? What would you like to hear more about? But also, just ask us literally anything to do with, Scottish politics, especially the stuff that the Common Weal has been getting up to in our policy work, and that can be, what have we done, or what are we planning to do, or what do you want to know more about? So, send us in anything, and we'll try and answer as many of the questions as we can.
Yeah, we look forward to doing so. And just to say as well that, when you send your questions in, let us know what you'd like to see more of, as Craig kind of outlines there. Next year, we're going to be putting a lot of thought into this podcast. We're going to be upgrading the technology. We're going to be upgrading the sound quality. And we're also going to be putting a lot of thought into how we can grow and build this podcast beyond its existing audience. We thank you for listening, for sharing the links. The last podcast went particularly well with Tim Rideout, but you've got the full library of podcasts available on the website, and there are a fair number now on a range of different policy issues, and we're quite pleased that we can offer that to you. As I usually say at this point in the podcast, we are funded totally by individual donors, which is quite an amazing feat considering everything that we do. So if you are in a position, I know things are difficult, but if you are in a position to give us a monthly donation, then please be assured that every penny will be spent on making sure that the kind of policies that Craig has been talking about in this and in other episodes are taken to the forefront of the Scottish political debate and to the core of Scottish government policy. That's what we aim to do. We aim to transform Scotland, and with your help, we believe that we can. And with that, we'll be back next week.